So I'm Stephen Haggard, and I'm talking to you today after having met you guys up at the OER conference in Newcastle 2 or 3 weeks ago. We were talking about stuff, and we just realised that there was a chance to share interesting things here today. I'm going to be talking really about issues. I want to try and ask what we mean about data. What does a good use of data look like? What does a fair use of data look like in the context of a development-oriented service? Do I need to be here?
If you could.
Oh, yes, because you're going to talk. I hate being behind stuff. I come at this from the perspective of having done a couple of case studies in this area, one with the World Web Foundation and the other with UNESCO, of some services that were operating in 2 different African nations, and I'm going to share some of the data and some of the insights from that with you today. Okay? The 2 apps that we're looking at when we get onto them are a sort of primary school quiz-based mobile education app, and the other is a farming app. So let's have a look. Just to review what we're not talking about, I think we've all understood, and we've seen some of these diagrams, the applications for mobile data in development, the classic one there of the Abidjan traffic, and then the epidemic tracking that you can get. That case has been proven of the ability to both track movements of devices and movements of calls that will allow us to pick up signals that are relevant for social and development purposes. That's fine, other people do that, that's not what we're talking about today. Another thing that we're not talking about, this is a talk I was at a couple of days ago from the Mobile for Development Intelligence Group. This is the perspective that commercial service operators take on how you use your data. So they've got these ideas around how you get system data to optimize the uptake of the service. So here would be a data-driven analysis of the users in a service, and they will be looking at drop-off. How do you optimize the service and get most uptake of it? They will look at where people fall out of the service, at the point of registration, or at the point of trying a service, and at the point of using a service, and why it is that when a service is launched in a mobile context, this is a classic development agricultural product that they were talking here, a mobile phone-based agricultural advice line, why you're actually only getting to 3 or 4% of people actually using it, of those who start at the funnel. So that's another classic use of data optimization of user experience. I had an argument with these guys actually after this talk saying that's a very narrow definition of how you could use data and how you could even improve services. It's simply about getting the numbers on the platform. And they pointed out, I think it's a fair argument, and it's one I'd like to pick up later. You can talk all you like about delivering behavior change through education or through any kind of development input that you're giving, until you've got actual take-up of the service that you're offering, until you've actually got adoption, you're talking to nobody. So for their point of view, although this is quite a narrow and commercial sense of how you use data on a mobile service, it's crucial, because until you've got through that point and you've upped that 4% of regular users and you've dealt with the 59% drop-off after registration, you might as well not be doing it. So I took that as a fair point, but it does come from the perspective of commercial platform operators who just want numbers, crude numbers on the service. And I think it's worth remembering that is a valid perspective. So let's talk about data and mobile learning. It's a different class of problem, I think, to other kinds of service. I'd like to use this quote, which came from Mike Tricano, who you may know, works on these kind of problems for the World Bank. If you think technology can solve your education problems, then you don't understand the problems and you don't understand the technology. The solution lies in process and systems and people. I think that's right. That's certainly where I stand. The gizmo itself, or the data about it, are just a sort of help on the journey to get you there. So looking at it from that point of view, I'd just like to share this data with you. This comes from the company Desire to Learn, who I have a consultancy relationship with around data products in the online learning space. We're looking here at data for 4 American community colleges and state universities on the effect of implementing an entirely data-driven support system through the university for students. So optimizing your course choice, giving you maximum support, spotting where you're dropping off, spotting where you're out of the social loop, where you haven't attended or downloaded or annotated the lectures. It's a heavy, full-on piece of enterprise software which is designed to support the educational program through a very intense technological environment. Now, something very interesting happens when you put these kind of systems in, which is that the achievement gap between the more advantaged and the less advantaged learners closes. And I think that's really interesting. You can see these kinds of very advanced software as merely benefiting those who are already steeped in educational advantage. But in this particular case, we see that the gap between Pell and non-Pell students, so Pell, if you're not familiar with it, is the way that in the North American system, and in the States particularly, you denominate students who are eligible for certain economic support. Generally, it's an index of economic deprivation. So the gap in terms of earned hours, which are credit scores that you get as you progress through the university, between the Pell and the non-Pell students, on average in these colleges was about an hour and a half per semester. So the disadvantaged students were falling behind it works out at just under 20% of their attainment was 20% behind. When you bring in an intensive exploitation of the data in the system, you can effectively close that gap, that achievement gap. And I think that's exciting because it does allow us to think that the job of data in any of these education-based systems is actually to address the needs of the most disadvantaged learners. That's actually what the technology seems to be saying to us, in this case anyway. Now let's move on to developing world. It's a different issue, maybe. I want to share with you an example from a company I work quite closely with. You may be aware of them. It's called Enisa Education, and they're based in Nairobi, and they run a very simple app on simple phones, usually by SMS, so that we're bringing out a smartphone version, where we have a pretty large audience of pupils who get served quizzes in a range of topics which are curriculum compliant, and that supports them in their learning. So let's talk about the data that comes out the back of this. We have three categories of data and three sort of audiences and users for the data, and let's concentrate on who benefits from it. Obviously the learners themselves, we can feed them back data like you're underscoring on this, you need to work harder on that, here are some more quizzes that you need to do to get yourself up to the level of this. That's a service that we're proving and we're finding that the learners respond to, so there is that sense of uptake of a data-driven feedback loop there. We're also able to distribute the data that comes out of the back end of the platform to parents. They're really interested in learning about their children's performance, and we see quite a lot of uptake for that, even to the extent that we think we can actually charge for it. This is a commercial service, I should add. It's funded entirely by the investment, its own investors. It does have some government clients, but there is no soft money behind this. It's all designed to make money for the owners of the service. And there's a final user of the data, which is the Education Ministry, which, although they're not yet paying for it, is able to get better insight on a day-by-day basis into some performance issues by school, by region, by teacher, by sector, than they can get from their own data, and much more cheaply. Compared to the cost of having observers on the ground, this really checks out. Let's have a look at some of the prices there. It looks like the value to the ministry is probably about 3 billion Kenyan shillings a month if you compare it to the cost of monitoring these kind of levels of performance at that level in the schools. That's a massive saving. Now, right now they're not paying that, and then maybe they shouldn't be made to pay it, but I think it's interesting to see potentially what benefits they could be getting from this kind of testing and feedback of pupil performance. Parents are being asked to pay 30 Kenyan shillings a month to get access to this, and they're paying. And that's an interesting test of the value of data. We've got about 8,000 parents paying that at the moment. I think that's interesting, that says something. And of course the learners get it free, as indeed they should. But that just shows you how the idea of extracting the data, performance data from the system, can lead to values that can be monetized in this kind of business model in a development setting. The other application I'd like to talk to you about is one based in Ghana, which I've visited and worked with on behalf of UNESCO as a best practice study. This is an application for cocoa farmers, and it aims to capture a pretty wide data range, usually an interview from the farmers on the ground. So you're seeing those particular data points captured there at the point that they register on the service, and they get, for registering, they get a lot of advice on particularly fertilizer dosage and pest management regime, and it does increase their yields very significantly. If you look at the benefits there, you're seeing 25% yield increase from farmers participating in the program, as well as other educational content that they get around the program, which is served to them usually in face-to-face settings, but the reminders to be there and the promotion of it is coming through their phones. And they're reducing their fertilizer costs. This is a really big benefit to farmers by up to 80%. They just are able to understand different approaches to using those inputs. So there's a cash inputs they're having to pay for. Those cash inputs are coming down as part of their farming, their farm budgets. So some very big benefits that we're seeing there. But I think it's quite interesting to try and look also at the benefits to the sponsoring organisation. So this particular project is sponsored by mainly by the Hershey Foundation and a couple of other major cocoa growers. So these guys have obviously got an interest here. Now, they control the entire value chain, right up and down. They have done satellite surveys of all these plots. So they're potentially able to marry data that they're obtaining for their own purposes through different technology to the data that's coming in from the farmers through the education service. And I think that creates a really big dilemma about who owns this data and who benefits from it. They have effectively got a free ride on the desperation of the cocoa farmers who are prepared to do an awful lot and sacrifice a lot of their data in order to both get some of the benefits that we're seeing here, but also some of these benefits are completely illusory. They perceive that when they sign up they might be able to get different kinds of credit or subsidy. It doesn't exist, it's not true, but that perception has remained very strong in the farming community, partly because this service is delivered in conjunction with the government in Ghana through COCOBOD, the cocoa agency. So we're seeing, I think, a potential problem here around the distribution of the benefits of analysing the data from the mobile service. I don't believe that Hershey has done this yet, but there is nothing to stop them using the satellite pictures they've got of every plot, saying that plot belongs to so-and-so. We know the buying values, we know what their production is, we can work it out from the satellite. This is our pricing policy. At the moment, this platform doesn't handle sales and e-commerce, but it can and it will. And very soon, the farmers are going to be actually trading their crops through the mobile platform, as well as getting all the learning inputs. And I'm really keen that we should ask, as an open educational resources community, when the education starts being sponsored by a commercial player, and when it moves, and when the device in your hand that delivers the education is also the device that is earning you your livelihood, because it's the one that's deciding when you're going to trade your product, who's benefiting from that? We don't know yet. I'm not blowing a whistle. I don't see any signs of foul play at all. So far, it all appears above board, but who knows? Next time the price takes a dip, let's watch it carefully. It's interesting just to look at it. I mean, I've got these figures here from Hershey profitability. You can see they're doing very well. You don't see these kind of figures in farmer profitability. And there's just an issue for me about how we share the benefits from moving into the age of data around education. Spreading those benefits, talked about that. Consent, in the case of both the pupils and the farmers, they have, at one level given their consent, but have they really? If you're a child in a Kenyan school and this is the way that you can satisfy the parent and community demand for higher performance, have you really given your consent to have that data shared and used by the ministry? Interesting question. Certainly in the case of the farmers, where there's so much perception and misperception around the benefits and the cash benefits of being part of a service that produces data. It's hard to say that these people have really understood who else is potentially benefiting from the data that's produced by their participation in this educational service. I'd just like to see a broader debate, really, based on the examples I've looked on who should be really benefiting from data-driven insight. As in the case from the American universities, arguably it's the most needy learners, but also maybe it's those who have got the best access to the technology, who knows. These are questions I don't have the answer to, but I just think they should be part of our consideration. Finally, just in closing, I like to think that we could think of the issues that are being raised by these mobile data service, because there's so much problem about who owns the data, is it sitting in the network, is it sitting in the platform, is it sitting in the operators, is it sitting in the service providers, that we could try and think of an open data commons around this. I'm very struck every time I work in Africa by these kind of systems. This is one I just photographed in Senegal in a taxi Bruce station, where people are distributing passengers and vehicles and drivers among themselves. A completely open data policy, which is who's going where, what the number of the car is, what order they're in, and how many people are available. I think that's a lovely example of everybody understanding where the data is and how you can use it and who can leverage it, and making sure that it is being fairly distributed between the different players in that system. And I think that one of the things I'd like to see being discussed as we move into a technology-driven, mobile-driven education age in the developing world is what are the right policies for sharing this sort of data openly when there are so many stakeholders with so many interests. That's all I've got to say, but let's hope the conversation is rich.